She knocked on the door. She listened for a sound, but she heard nothing. She knocked again, put her hand on the knob, gave it a turn, but only to realize it was locked. She spoke up and said, "Alice, are you okay?" Alice groaned and said, "Yeah. I'm sick." She didn't get up to unlock the door though. She just lied there on the bed. Helen turned and walked away. She made her way back down the stairs and out the back door to the chicken house. She still had a lot of work to do in there. She had to check for floods and pick up dead chickens, which she would feed to the pigs. She thought herself, they would eat anything. I bet they would eat me if I laid down in there. Days later, Helen was working in the chicken house as always, and it was getting closer to Christmas still. All of a sudden, Bill came running through the chicken house screaming at the top of his lungs, "Helen! Helen!" But she couldn't make out what he was saying. As he got closer, she could see him better, and he looked like he had seen his ghost. His face was extremely pale and almost as white as snow. She could tell by the look on his face that something was terribly wrong. "Come on!" screamed Bill. "Alice's water broke and she needs to go to the hospital now." Helen dropped the dead chickens she had picked up, and they both ran back to the house as fast as they could. As they got back to the house, Alice was standing there crying. Helen told Bill to go in the house to get her purse and keys, then meet her at her car. She walked Alice to the car and helped her get in, and then she got in too. Then Bill came running back out to her car, which was a 1970 Chevy Malibu. He handed her the keys and her purse. She told Bill to call ahead to the doctor and pick up the dead chickens while she brought Alice to the hospital. "Okay," he replied as they pulled out of the driveway. She sped and got on Highway Route 50 going west towards Salisbury. He went back inside, jumped on the phone, and called the hospital to let them know Alice was coming. Afterwards he hung up the phone. Helen could see Alice was getting close, and she mashed the gas pedal harder. She was going 75 miles per hour. Then she decided to push the gas pedal even harder, and now she was driving at 95 miles per hour all the way there. Helen said, "I hope I don't get a ticket for speeding," as they flew down the highway. When they were pulling up at the Peninsula General Hospital, there was a nurse waiting for them with a wheelchair. Helen pulled the car to a stop, then the nurse opened the door and helped Alice into the chair. She turned the chair around to push her inside while Helen went and parked the car. She locked her doors and ran inside. All this time, Bill was supposed to be finishing in the chicken house for Helen. Instead, Bill went in the kitchen so he could get him a glass of milk as he walked back into the living room to sit down on the couch and drink his glass of milk. He didn't want to go back outside, or back in the chicken house. Bill hated the smell. So after he had finished his milk, then he just lay back on the couch and went to sleep. He really didn't care that Alice was having his baby. He wasn't father material anyway. All he ever cared about was himself and no one else. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, the doctor asked Helen if he could speak to her alone, and she replied, "Yes, sir." She followed him to a small office where they could have some privacy, and he closed the door behind them. He spoke up and said, "Mrs. Hatter, you know Alice is still on the horse, don't you?" She looked at him with a bellowing sadness in her eyes and said, "Yes, sir, I did." He then said, "I gave her a morphine drip for her pain and her withdrawals. I will be honest with you though, things are not looking well for the baby. I don't think he's going to make it through the night just like the rest. I mean, that's my opinion, but I'm really sorry." She just let her head hang down as tears rolled down her cheek like a flash flood. Helen knew he was telling the truth, and she knew Alice was hooked on heroin, but Bill didn't have a clue. Helen asked the doctor to not say anything to Alice's husband because he did not know about her problem. The doctor told her, "I have to tell him. It is required by law." She sighed and said, "Okay," thinking to herself, things are really about to go bad big time. Helen was very upset and tired. She decided to go and get a cup of coffee to wake her up a little. After all, she had already worked all last night and a lot today. She was already exhausted before she got there. Not to mention, she sat in the hospital for hours. Helen was afraid to go and see the baby because she didn't want to become attached. She was afraid he was going to die like the other two because of Alice's problem with the horse heroin, which meant the baby would be addicted to it too even if he did live. Helen knew that was why the other two died. She never told Bill though because she didn't feel like it was her place to tell him, and so he still didn't know anything about it. In the newborn's nursery, doctors and nurses run around frantically. It was Alice's baby they were working on. He had all kinds of tubes and force hooked to him, a breathing machine, and a heart monitor. His name was Jimmy, well if he lived that is. They didn't expect him to make it through the night because he was so premature, underweight, and addicted to heroin. By this time, Helen had come to see baby Jimmy in the nursery, but there were lots of babies in the nursery. She didn't know which one was him as she looked over all the babies. She realized he was the one with all the doctors and nurses crowded around him. She began to cry when she realized that it was him who had all the machines, wires, and force attached to him. The tears wouldn't stop flowing out of her eyes as she turned her head and looked away from baby Jimmy. She felt like there was a ton of bricks on her chest. Helen figured she would try to call Bill and tell him that Alice had a boy. Helen thought to herself, my daughter is going to drive me to drinking. What she didn't realize was Alice had already done it a long time ago. Meanwhile, back at the house, Bill was still fast asleep. Then, the phone rang. Bill did not hear it, however. Helen was calling him to tell him that Alice had another boy, but Jimmy was in bad shape. The doctor said he was sorry there wasn't much that they could do for him because of all his problems and complications. Jimmy was so tiny you could hold him in the palm of your hand. He only weighed 3.5 pounds. Helen went back to fill her cup with coffee. She was so tired that she could barely hold her eyes open. After she filled her cup, she went to Alice's room, which was on the 4th floor in room 406, to see how she was doing. When she got there, Alice was asleep, so she sat down in a chair and slowly sipped her coffee as it was very hot. Little Jimmy was in intensive care, and to be honest, every second was a fight for his life. Things looked grim for him. You know it can't be good when a baby is brought into this world hooked on heroin. Helen decided to go back to see how Jimmy was doing, or to see if there were any improvements in his health, but when she got there he was gone. Then, chills ran down her spine like ice had gone through her blood, and tears began to roll down her face like a runaway river once more as she stood there crying, and her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. All of a sudden, someone tapped her on the shoulder. As she turned to face them, she knew who it was. It was the doctor. He pulled her to the side to some chairs and said, "Have a seat." She did as he asked. She broke down and cried more and more. Helen, I need to tell you something." The more he tried to talk to her, the more she cried. He finally got the words out. "We had to move him to another room." He said. "Oh my God." She said, "Is he okay?" "No, Helen, he's about the same, but at least he's alive, made it through the night. To be honest with you, we don't think he's going to make it much longer, but we will do all we can for him. A baby that is exposed to heroin is at high risk for a number of afflictions after birth, including hypoglycemia, intracranial hemorrhage, premature birth, breathing problems, and low birth weight. While in withdrawal from the drug, the baby may experience tremors, seizures, vomiting, moodiness, itchiness, difficulty sleeping, fever, and diarrhea." His words cut through her like a knife. He said, "I wouldn't get your hopes up. If there is a chance he does happen to make it, he may have mental problems. He could be clinically insane." He said, "You look worn out, Helen. You should go home and get some sleep." She replied, "I can't leave him," as the river of tears started again. The doctor said, "I understand, Helen." He told her to wait in her chair and that he would be right back. A few minutes later, he came back and handed her 2 pills, a nerve pill and a sleeping pill. He said, "These will help you calm down and get some sleep." It was 9 a.m. now, and Helen wondered if Bill was up yet. So, she went to a payphone out in the lobby, picked up the receiver, put in a dime, and put it to her ear as she dialed the number. 835-8185. It started to ring. It kept ringing and Bill never picked up. Where the hell is he? She thought to herself. She figured he should be up by now, but then again, she knew how lazy he was. She hung up the phone and started walking toward room 69 ICU. That's where they moved baby Jimmy. She was going by room 52 as she thought to herself, there sure are a lot of rooms. Oh Lord, give me something to believe in, Helen thinking to herself. She was hoping little baby Jimmy would get better. By this time, Bill had come to the hospital. As he came around the corner, he almost ran into Helen. The doctor came down,